Marcia had always loved driving in the quiet of the early evening, the fading light of dusk giving the world a soft golden hue. Tonight, however, as she drove along the winding country road toward her new job, the peace that usually accompanied her on these drives was overshadowed by a nervous energy. Tomorrow she would officially assume the role of chief of police in a new town, a historic moment for both her and the community. As the first black woman to ever hold the position, Marcia knew she was stepping into uncharted territory, both as a leader and as a symbol for many. As she rounded a bend, the familiar flash of red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Marcia's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her car was in perfect condition. There was no reason to be pulled over. Still, she sighed and pulled the car to the side of the road, the sirens wailing until she came to a complete stop. Two police officers emerged from the cruiser. They approached slowly, one on each side of her vehicle. Both were white men, their faces expressionless but their body language stiff with authority. Marcia had seen this countless times, too many times to count. In fact, this was a routine she knew all too well. The stern look, the hands resting just a little too close to their holsters, the subtle tension in their movements, all of it, unspoken but clear. The officer on the driver's side reached her window first. He didn't greet her, didn't ask how she was doing. Instead, he cut straight to his demand. License and registration. Marcia had barely rolled down her window before he barked the order. She glanced at him briefly, her pulse quickening, but she kept her composure. She knew better than to let her emotions show. Years of navigating situations like this had taught her that maintaining calm was crucial, no matter how blatant the disrespect. "Sure, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" she asked, her voice steady. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. He was tall with a shaved head and a sharp jawline. His partner, standing by the passenger side of the car, peered into the vehicle, silently observing her every move. "It's a routine traffic stop. Just show me your documents," he said, the impatience in his tone barely concealed. Marcia bit the inside of her cheek as she reached for her license and registration, careful to make her movements slow and deliberate. She knew that any sudden gesture could be misinterpreted. Handing over the documents, she watched the officer take them without even glancing at her properly, his focus instead on running her information through their system. The second officer, still standing by her passenger side, shifted his weight and looked her up and down. There was something in his gaze, disbelief, perhaps, as if he were trying to reconcile what he was seeing with his own assumptions. A black woman, alone, driving a nice car. It didn't fit into whatever narrative he had built in his head. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. Marcia kept her hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, trying to suppress the rising frustration. She wasn't a stranger to this type of treatment, but tonight of all nights it felt particularly unjust. She was on her way to assume leadership over these very officers, or at least their colleagues, and here she was, being treated as if she were a criminal, as if she didn't belong. Finally, the officer returned to her window, a hint of suspicion still lingering in his expression. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, though the question carried more accusation than curiosity. "To work," Marcia replied simply, her gaze unwavering. The officer raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" Marcia hesitated for just a moment, her fingers tightening slightly on the wheel. She could play along, answer vaguely, and let them draw their own conclusions. But she was tired. Tired of playing by rules that were stacked against her. Tired of the subtle and sometimes not so subtle racism that she encountered in situations like this. Tonight she wasn't just another driver being pulled over. She was the chief of police, and it was time they knew that. The silence that followed Marcia's words was thick, tense, and loaded with disbelief. The officer who had demanded her license stood frozen, blinking as if he hadn't heard her correctly. His partner, still leaning by the passenger side, straightened up abruptly, his eyes darting toward Marcia with a mixture of confusion and skepticism. The officer recovered first, though his tone now carried an edge of condescension. "Chief of police?" he repeated, almost as if he was mocking her. His lips twitched into a smirk. "You're saying you are the new chief?" Marcia could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She had seen this kind of disbelief before, the kind that refused to acknowledge a black woman in a position of power. It wasn't new, but it still stung every time. She nodded calmly. "That's correct. I'm the new chief of police." The second officer walked around the car and joined his partner. His arms were crossed, a skeptical frown pulling at his features. "You expect us to believe that?" he scoffed, glancing at his partner, clearly trying to maintain control over the situation. He let out a short laugh. as if the idea of her being in charge was nothing but a joke. Marcia took a deep breath. She had thought about revealing her identity sooner, but had hoped it wouldn't come to this, hope that they would handle a routine stop professionally. But this was far from that. It was clear now that these men had pulled her over for reasons that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the color of her skin. "What I expect," Marcia began, her voice steady but firm, "is that you conduct yourselves professionally, regardless of who you believe I am. But since there seems to be some confusion, allow me to clarify, I am your new boss." Her words were like a slap, cutting through the smugness that had been lingering on their faces. The officer holding her documents shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering for the first time. He glanced down at her license as if hoping it would offer him some kind of explanation or loophole out of this. "And if you run my information," Marcia added, nodding toward the police car where their computer system was waiting, "you'll see everything you need to know." For a moment, neither officer moved. They just stood there, tension thick in the air. The second officer finally turned on his heel and stalked back to their cruiser, muttering something under his breath. His partner stayed behind, his face caught between anger and uncertainty. He still hadn't handed back her documents, as if holding on to them gave him some semblance of control over the situation. Minutes dragged on. Marcia could see the second officer in the police car, typing on the computer, his face growing tighter with each passing second. It was clear that whatever he was seeing on the screen was confirming exactly what she had told them. Finally he returned, his face pale under the harsh glare of the cruiser's lights. His eyes avoided Marcia's, and there was no trace of the smirk that had been there just moments ago. He leaned toward his partner, whispering something quickly. The officer with her documents stiffened, his mouth tightening into a thin line. He turned back to Marcia, his demeanor now a mess of uncertainty and regret. Mom, he stammered, clearly unsure of how to backpedal from the situation. His partner looked just as uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hands fumbling at his sides. Marcia could see the panic in their eyes. They had realized too late who they were dealing with, and now they were scrambling for an excuse, something, anything to justify their behavior. But she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without holding them accountable. "Is there a problem?" Marcia asked, her voice deceptively calm as she leaned slightly out of her window, meeting their eyes head-on. "No, Chief. We were just, performing a routine check," the first officer muttered, fumbling as he handed her back the license and registration with hands that now shook slightly. There was no offense meant. "No offense?" Marcia raised an eyebrow. "You pulled me over for no reason, kept me waiting far longer than necessary, and questioned my authority. This was not a routine stop. It was harassment." The officers exchanged nervous glances. They were trapped, and they knew it. The second officer cleared his throat awkwardly. We didn't know, ma'am. We didn't realize." "And that's the problem," Marcia interrupted, her voice cold now, cutting through their excuses. "You saw me, a black woman driving a nice car, and you assumed I didn't belong. You thought I was someone you could intimidate or control. You were wrong. But this situation is about much more than just me. This is about how you conduct yourselves when you think no one is watching." Both officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The authority and dignity with which Marcia carried herself made it impossible for them to respond with anything other than quiet shame. "Now," Marcia continued, her voice firm but laced with restrained fury, "I will be seeing both of you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. We will have a very serious conversation about what has transpired here tonight, and I promise you this behavior will not go unchecked." With that, she rolled up her window, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and satisfaction. As she drove away, the two officers remained standing by the side of the road, their figures small and defeated in the rearview mirror. They knew, just as Marcia did, that the next time they saw her, their entire careers might be on the line. The next morning, the tension in the police station was palpable. Word had spread quickly among the officers after the incident the night before, and now everyone was on edge, waiting to see how the new chief would handle it. The two officers, Patrolman Davis and Collins, stood awkwardly by the entrance to Marcia's office, their faces pale, their shoulders tense. They had already been called in for a meeting, and both knew it was going to be anything but easy. Inside her office, Marcia sat at her desk, reviewing reports with a calm expression, but beneath that calm she was simmering. Last night's events played on repeat in her mind. This was exactly the kind of behavior she had hoped to change by accepting the role of chief of police. She had worked too hard for too long to see the same toxic culture persist under her watch. She was done with the complacency, done with the excuses. Her assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Chief Marcia, Officers Davis and Collins are here to see you." "Send them in," Marcia replied. her voice steady. The two officers entered, their posture stiff and their faces lined with a mixture of regret and apprehension. They both knew they had overstepped, and now they had no choice but to face the consequences. Marcia gestured toward the two chairs in front of her desk. "Sit," she said, her voice firm but not raised. They obeyed, sitting down slowly, hands resting nervously in their laps. Neither spoke. But Marcia allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before she finally looked up from her papers and met their eyes. "Do you understand why you're here?" she asked, her gaze steady. Davis, the more senior of the two, cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am, Chief," he stammered, still getting used to addressing her with the title he had previously doubted. We just want to say that we didn't mean any disrespect last night. We didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" Marcia interrupted, leaning forward slightly. Her tone was measured, but the steel in her words was unmistakable. "We didn't realize that I was your new boss. Or didn't realize that pulling over a black woman for no valid reason was wrong." Collins, who had been silent up until now, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Chief, it wasn't about race. We were just doing our job. Routine traffic stop." "A routine stop," Marcia cut in, her eyes narrowing. "Routine stops don't take that long, Officer Collins. And routine stops don't involve intimidation, suspicion, and unnecessary delays when there's no evidence of wrongdoing. You saw me driving a car that you thought I shouldn't be driving, and you made assumptions. Assumptions based on my appearance." Both officers looked down, unable to meet her gaze. They knew she was right. Marcia leaned back in her chair, watching them for a moment before continuing. "This is what I want you to understand," she said, her voice softer but no less powerful. "Your actions last night weren't just about me. This is bigger than one incident. It's about the way you treat the people you swore to serve and protect. You saw me and made a judgment without knowing anything about me. And if you're doing that to me, a woman in a position of authority, I can only imagine what you're doing to the people in this community who don't have that power. People who don't have the ability to defend themselves the way I can." The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on the two officers. They had no rebuttal. They had been caught. And now they were being held accountable. "We're sorry, Chief," Davis said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." Marcia's eyes hardened slightly. "I'm not interested in apologies, Officer Davis. I'm interested in accountability. And this is not going to be swept under the rug. The fact that you even felt comfortable acting the way you did last night tells me that this isn't an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem, one that I am here to fix." Both men looked up, confusion crossing their faces. They hadn't expected her to be this direct, but Marcia wasn't done. "Starting today, there will be changes," she said, her tone sharp and final. "Effective immediately, there will be mandatory bias training for all officers. There will be regular evaluations of how you interact with the community, and I will personally oversee those evaluations. This department has a reputation, and it's not a good one. That changes now. And if any of you," she paused, looking both men in the eye, "think you can't work under these conditions, you're welcome to leave." The room went silent again. The message was clear. There would be no more excuses, no more room for prejudice to hide behind a badge. Marcia wasn't just there to fill a position. She was there to reform the very foundation of how policing was done in this town. "Do you understand?" Marcia asked, her voice a touch softer but still carrying the weight of authority. Both officers nodded quickly. "Yes, Chief," they said in unison. "Good. You're dismissed," Marcia said, waving them toward the door. They stood up and left quietly, their faces drained of any arrogance they had carried with them the night before. The atmosphere in the police station had shifted dramatically. The unspoken rules of the past were no longer valid under Marcia's leadership, and everyone in the building could feel it. Later that afternoon, Marcia called a department-wide meeting. Every officer in the building gathered in the briefing room, some curious, others anxious. The events of last night had spread like wildfire, and everyone was wondering what would happen next. Marcia stood at the front of the room, her posture tall and commanding. As the officers settled into their seats, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I called this meeting because I want to make something very clear," she began, her voice ringing out across the room. "This department will no longer tolerate any form of discrimination, bias, or abuse of power. I don't care how things were done before. That era is over." She looked out at the sea of faces in front of her, seeing a mix of reactions. Some officers were nodding, others were stone-faced, but Marcia wasn't there to appease anyone. She was there to lead. "We are here to serve the people of this town. All of them. not just the ones who look like us or who fit into a certain mold. If you cannot commit to that mission, if you cannot treat every person with the respect and dignity they deserve, then this is not the place for you." The room was deathly quiet. No one dared to speak. "I am committed to making this department a place of integrity and fairness," Marcia continued. "But that will only happen if every single one of you is willing to change. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for accountability." With those final words, Marcia turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a department that was no longer sure of its footing, but fully aware that change had come. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The police department, once known for its outdated practices and deep-seated biases, had begun to shift under Marcia's leadership. The officers, many of whom had initially resisted her changes, now found themselves working in a new environment, one where accountability, transparency, and respect were no longer just words in a mission statement, but were actively enforced. Marcia's incident with Officers Davis and Collins became more than just a story within the department. It spread throughout the community, then to neighboring towns, and soon the media caught wind of it. Articles appeared online, first in local news outlets, and then in national publications, hailing Marcia as a trailblazer, a symbol of change in a system long plagued by injustice. But Marcia wasn't interested in the attention. She hadn't taken the job to be in the spotlight. Her goal was simple: to make the community safer, and to ensure that every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could trust the people who were supposed to protect them. One afternoon, several months after the night she had been pulled over, Marcia received a letter in her office. It was from a woman in the community, a single mother who had lived in the town her whole life. In the letter, the woman described how, for years, she had feared the police, felt invisible, and worried constantly for her teenage son, who had already been harassed multiple times simply for walking through his own neighborhood. But since Marcia had become chief, things had changed. The police were more present, but not in the same threatening way they had been before. Officers were engaging with the community, asking how they could help, not assuming the worst. The letter ended with a simple line: "Thank you for giving us hope. We believe in the system again because of you." Marcia sat in her office, reading the letter over and over. It was the kind of validation that no headline or interview could provide. This was the reason she had fought for this position. The reason she endured the challenges and doubts. She knew the work was far from over, but moments like this reminded her that change, real change, was possible. That evening, Marcia decided to walk through the town. As she strolled past the local shops and quiet streets, she noticed people nodding in her direction, offering smiles. Some waved, and others stopped to say hello. Many of them, she recognized people she had seen at community meetings or during her outreach efforts. There was something different in their eyes now, a kind of trust that hadn't been there before. Marcia could feel it, the bond that was growing between the police and the people they served. As she continued walking, she passed a mural that hadn't been there the last time she'd come this way. It was painted on the side of an old brick building, vibrant colors bursting from the wall. The mural depicted a black woman standing tall, her hands resting on her hips, a police badge shining on her chest. The figure was strong, proud, and surrounded by symbols of justice: scales, olive branches, and rays of light. At the bottom of the mural, in bold letters, it read, "For Justice and Equality, Chief Marcia Brown." Marcia stopped, staring at the mural in awe. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected to become a symbol, but the sight of it filled her with a sense of deep pride and responsibility. She smiled, her heart full, knowing that this wasn't just a painting of her, it was a reflection of what the town had become, of the new path they were all walking together. The battle against racial bias and injustice was far from over, but for the first time, the town had hope. And so did Marcia. She had transformed more than a police department, she had helped transform a community. As the sun set behind her, casting a golden glow over the mural, Marcia walked away, knowing that while there was still much to be done, this was just the beginning of something beautiful.